So it's with great pleasure I welcome Christoffer Söderlund Kanarp from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, which we more commonly know of as SLU, to Researcher's Desk. And Christoffer is going to talk with us today about taking ourselves from imagination to practical understandings, making meaning in climate change adaptation. Christoffer, thank you so much for joining us here at Researcher's Desk today. I'm going to turn my camera off and my microphone off, but I'm in the background, so should something stop working, I'll jump in right away. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great, thank you. Really happy to be here presenting. I'm going to talk about the work that I did in my thesis. The title of the thesis is the same as this talk, From Imagination to Practical Understandings, Meaning Making and Climate Change Adaptation. And I am now a researcher in environmental communication, and as Alasdair said, at the Department of Urban and Rural Development at SLU. So my research concerns climate change adaptation, and I have in particular studied the assumptions and visions about the future relating to climate change and the routines and norms that are reproduced in the settings where decisions about adaptation measures and strategies are taken. In short, the meaning-making process is shaping what is seen as necessary and relevant responses to the climate crisis in terms of adaptation. So mostly my work has focused on Sweden and civil servants at different levels in the public sector working with adaptation. And this is what my talk will be about, but I thought that I would begin by saying something about environmental communication, as this is my field of research and been my academic home for about 10 years now. So that, of course, influences how I approach research and this study. So environmental communication investigates communication challenges associated with environmental and sustainability issues. But I think it's worth clarifying that the research that I do and the colleagues in environmental communication at SLU are involved in is based on a view of communication as constitutive and not just instrumental, which means that communication is not just a means to convey information or influence or convince someone. We see communication as it is through communication that knowledge and legitimacy and learning and power, etc., is negotiated. So in short, communication processes shape our understanding of ourselves and society, including how we understand environmental issues and problems and their solutions. And what I've done is to focus then on adaptation. And my entry point into adaptation is, or this research in general, is that just to say that I understand the climate crisis as an existential crisis for modern society, and especially for the lifestyles that we lead in the industrialized and affluent parts of the world. So we need transformative responses, meaning reshaping our political systems, our economies, and the very values that are embedded in our cultures, shaping what we understand as a good society or what a good life is. And I think this is fairly uncontroversial nowadays. There's similar formulations are coming from the UN and representatives of the IPCC and very well-established academics. But I think that this is worth reiterating in connection to adaptation, because since adaptation was sort of reinvented in the late 80s, early 90s as anticipatory responses to human-induced climate change, it has very much been understood and treated as something technical based on engineering, just an apolitical response to external effects of climate change. But coming from a critical adaptation scholarly tradition, I argue together with others that this is not how we should understand adaptation. It is not apolitical. And this is simply because due to the inherent uncertainty of anticipatory adaptation and the political nature of prioritizing what to protect, how, when, and whose interests prevail, the reasoning behind preferred adaptation strategies are always more complex than just responding to climate change and their immediate consequences. So in short, I understand adaptation as not an end in itself. It is a means to protect or create a desirable society. The question is then, whose desirable society? And to say something about the aims of my thesis, which are, as you see, quite large, but this is sort of the discussions that I want to contribute to. So starting with the first part on shedding light on how we can understand the inertia in adapting to climate change. We all know that mitigation is going too slowly, but I think it's fair to say it's almost a bigger problem in adaptation. And definitely if we are looking at transformative adaptation, that adaptation also needs to be part of transforming society rather than just protecting a society that is perpetuating the causes of the climate crisis. And secondly, then I wanted to contribute with some empirical reflections on how to move towards transformative adaptation. And the way that I have gone about this, to study this, is on the one hand to study globally influential text on adaptation, both so-called Braille literature, which has included IPCC reports, reports on from World Trade Organization, and states and cities that have been producing adaptation programs or policies that have been very widely shared and used and referenced by other actors in their work with adaptation, but also to look at academic literature that has been highly cited. But importantly here also to look or to focus on literature that has not just been cited and used in academia, but the academic literature on adaptation that has made its way out into the governance of adaptation and used by other actors. So that's on the one hand side. But what I've mostly done is participant observation and interviews with civil servants working with adaptation at different levels in Sweden, meaning being at meetings of both key sites and networks that are working with adaptation in Sweden, conferences, workshops, doing interviews with a lot of civil servants, both on government authorities level, but also on the regional level with county administrative boards, and to some extent also with municipality, specifically in the region of Norrbotten in Sweden. And I've also done text analysis on important documents in Sweden, ranging from laws and policies to reports, and connected to the participant observations, also been part of email conversations and been part of these networks that are working with adaptation in Sweden. So moving on to sort of my theoretical frameworks and how I approached studying the governance of adaptation. Well, you have to have that up for a little while. I was a little fast with the clicking here, but I've approached the governance of adaptation in sort of from two complementing directions. On the one hand, in order to sort of map competing assumptions and ideas about climate change, and specifically the purposes and boundaries of adaptation governance, I have drawn on critical future studies, where the sort of main point of critical future studies is to say that the future is inherently probable, unknowable, and establishing a vision of the future as desirable or even inevitable is a very powerful political tool. So using the concept of imaginaries, I have tried to use this to understand what are the ideas, what are the boundaries, what are the purposes of the adaptation work that is done mostly in Sweden. But to understand where imaginaries and the concept comes from, I think it's first good to say that one understanding of it is that collective visions or joint ideas and assumptions about how the society and the world works are necessary for a society or even to make social interaction possible. For example, that we have the joint understanding or belief that we live in a democracy, or agreements are generally followed, money has value, etc. That sort of creates a basis for society and social interaction. That's one understanding that I draw on, but an overlapping and more critical understanding of imaginaries is to say that to establish a collective vision of a desirable future is a means to shape politics and the development of society in the present. So establishing a particular vision of a future is a very powerful political tool. And this means that to study imaginaries in this sense is to study competing imaginaries that are trying to shape the governance of adaptation and what it is supposed to achieve and what is beyond adaptation and who should be responsible for adaptation, etc. But the definition that I've used to put it in the context of climate adaptation is a collectively held vision of a desirable future that is materially embedded and politically performative, that relates to climate change and contains adaptation strategies for its realization. So this is to say that in my usage, there are imaginaries that are not relevant for climate change or adaptation specifically. That is sort of to understand the societal competing ideas of society, our beliefs and ideas about the future in relation to climate change and adaptation, and how that shapes the governance of adaptation. To try to understand what is happening within governance systems, and specifically in Sweden, then I have drawn on social practice theory, which is a theory that holds that meaning making and understanding is co-created in the social context, in the practices that we find ourselves in. So practice theory holds that most of our daily actions are guided by routines, situated norms and assumptions, and very often implicit ends. And my argument then is that this approach can bring new insights into studying adaptation and the governance of it and explaining the inertia that is sort of reproduced in dealing with climate change and adaptation. And three sort of core ideas that have been important for me in this research has been, firstly, that people do what makes sense for them in a given situation. We do what we understand as normal, expected, but this is not to be understood as something wholly individual, but it is situated at the super individual level. Like we do what makes sense in the context that we're in. Secondly, what people do is largely based on unreflective and practical understandings or know-how, and not consciously reflected or deliberated on. And I think that this is fairly intuitive, that we couldn't go through our day just trying to deliberate with ourselves on everything that we need to do. Everything from what's the best time to go get a coffee, or should I say hello to the bus driver when I step on, etc. It doesn't mean that we go on autopilot. It just means that we just go about our day. My point is that this is relevant even in situations where adaptation is discussed and decided about in the public sector. And thirdly, action and interaction are always situated materially. So artifacts and environment do not simply enable action, but actively shapes our actions and practices. And I think that this is intuitive as well, to the extent that, just for example, if we would have this seminar if we all were in the same room, the dynamics and what we could do and not do would change. But more mundanely, if we think about when we go home to make dinner tonight, of course, that will be sort of shaped by what we have in our fridge, but also more long-term on just the layout of our kitchen. So to understand why people act as they do, or how a practice evolves and what is seen as possible or not, we must also be conscious about the materiality on where this practice actually plays out. So this is what I've used to try to understand what is happening and not happening in adaptation governance. Yeah, a definition then that I've used on practice in my work is a situated patterning of behavior, speech, body language, even thoughts, that through taking for granted assumptions and routine guide its performance toward a shared purpose. And just to quickly say something about my research questions then, the first one is, how do globally circulating imaginaries with a bearing on climate change adaptation relate to and shape imaginaries in Sweden? And what underlying assumptions and values connect these visions? Secondly, what characterizes current practices and key sites for negotiating adaptation in the Swedish public sector? And third, how can transformative approaches to adaptation be understood through the integrated framework of imaginaries and practices? And how can transformative processes be promoted? And to really condense and summarize my findings here then, I find that two dominant imaginaries are dominant and present from the global level to the Swedish national level, all the way down to how adaptation is performed through the practices in the public sector. The first I called the eco-modern state, which alludes to the eco-modernism manifesto, where the sort of desired future, the ideal society, what we should be striving for is a stable nation state built around economic growth and high employment, and the sort of hope or belief that we are actually, or at least going to, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this vision, in this imaginary, adaptation is seen as important as a strategy to realize this future. So adaptation here becomes construed as needs to be proactive, meaning that we need to try to accommodate and respond to coming consequences, not just act reactively. But adaptation also becomes very much incremental, taking small steps, protecting current system, not transforming in the way that research is saying that we need. And it's also very focused on direct effects, which means here sort of heat waves, floods, cloudbursts, etc., within the geographical vicinity of the actor, if that's the state or if the municipality, but what is happening within their area. That's what adaptation should be about. And this leads to adaptation being understood as it should be driven by technical solutions and expert-led planning. And sort of the competing, the other dominant, the alternative that is influencing both sort of divisions, the understanding, but also the practices of doing adaptation, is what I call Promethean green growth, which is a nod to Dreisek's very well-known environmental discourses. And the sort of ideal society here, what we should achieve or strive for, or what is seen as a good society, is a globally interconnected market society, where the focus is on economic growth and increased trade, and very much intertwined with this neoliberal idea of an autonomous individual that is able to make rational, informed choices, usually in sort of a consumer role. In this vision, this imaginary, adaptation is also understood as important and necessary to achieve and uphold this ideal society or division. And again, adaptation is seen as it needs to be proactive. It needs to accommodate future risks as well. But again, it's very incremental, focused on protecting the market and its institution. And a little bit more paradoxically, here too, in its expressions, both in the literature and in interviews, etc., it's very focused on direct effects, things happening within the vicinity of the actor. And it is paradoxical in this sense, or in this imaginary, because the whole imaginary assumes the benefits of a globally interconnected market society, that we will be able to continue to trade, continue to travel, continue to have a society that is based on just-in-time deliveries, etc. but it ignores all the risks that climate change will inevitably have for these kind of systems. So more concretely, for example, in Norrbotten, they are talking about climate change often as something, well, sometimes existential, very much a type of crisis for the world. But they are still seeing that, well, since glaciers are going to melt, since the North Sea is going to melt, this becomes a comparative advantage on the global market, that they will be able to fly tourists in for winter vacations longer than they will be able to do in the Alps, or even than they will be able to do in Dalarna in Sweden. And here, the way to sort of do adaptation, what should drive adaptation, is more innovation and expanding the market. In some expressions, to the point of thoroughly financializing adaptation, that adaptation becomes a wholly profit-driven endeavor. That areas that are not seen as profitable to adapt should just be left on their own then. And there are some common assumptions in the dominant adaptations and practices. First of all, that climate change is assumed and understood to be gradual, fairly slow moving and gradual, no tipping points, no sort of transboundary risks in that sense. And that the future is predictable and largely controllable, that we are in control in the future of the future and societal developments. But interestingly, in most of the academic literature and in the practices, more temporal reflections, like explicitly discussing assumptions or strategies on when we believe things might happen, when we should respond, or what timeframes we use, these issues are largely missing from the literature and from the practices that I've studied. And it means that sort of long-term perspectives and plausible high-risk scenarios are downplayed, even ignored. So to say something about how this plays out in the practices that I've studied, to give some examples. One of the civil servants that I've seen as very influential in the Swedish context had a presentation for about 80 adaptation experts from different organizations in the Swedish public sector, and said that the low-hanging fruit are the most prioritized. So what they should be doing is easy wins, small steps, not this kind of thinking about the long-term consequences of the system. So it sort of exemplifies how adaptation becomes understood as something very incremental, short-term, and in practice very much focused on more information. That this becomes construed as the appropriate strategy. This is how we should do adaptation. This is what will be sufficient to deal with the climate crisis. There is sort of a darker side to this, that again, from my work and in an interview with a civil servant, the civil servant said that, well, your research or my tinkering project here in the far north won't help. In this civil servant's reasoning, there were no signs that we will be able to break with the economic growth paradigm in time to avert worse climate catastrophes and the degradation of living standards, etc. But importantly, what I show is that the same. Oh, let's see what's happening here. Let's see what's happening with the presentation. But what I was going to continue with is that the same civil servants are still in their work in the settings where they actually negotiate and discuss and do adaptation governance, keep reproducing the same ends, the same sort of routines, the same norms, the same incremental approach to adaptation, the same kind of short-term strategies, even in settings of networks that are set up as cross-cutting forums to discuss more long-term consequences and the need to go beyond the sectoral focus on just a sliver of what is needed. Even in these kind of situations or forums, the same logics are reproduced. So importantly, what I show then is that the same civil servants that are expressing this doubt about their work and the guiding visions of adaptation governance and where society should be going and how we should be doing adaptation, they still reproduce the same kind of assumptions, norms, routines, and ends when they are working with adaptation. And this is what I then try to entangle in my thesis based on practice theory on how the practices within the public sector shaping adaptation has sort of these kind of logics ingrained, and there is no space to open up to really talk about these, the work, why they are doing the work as they are doing it, what they want to achieve, etc. So what happens is this kind of divide between what they do, what they believe they need to do, that for some actually take the expression of doing their work as civil servants and being an activist on the side, but in other instances reproducing their work when they are a civil servant, but when they are in an interview or when they are in workshops or in other sort of kind of context, they are very aware of the work that they are doing now will not be enough. So moving towards sort of the last part of this talk then, and saying something about, well, how can we start breaking with these incremental adaptation practices? And of course, I don't have any definite answers here. But what I find in the situations that I've been is that a first critical step is to create these spaces for jointly reflecting upon the assumptions that guide current work. And from a practice perspective, it's also important that this is done in the practices where adaptation is actually performed and done. It will not be enough to have courses on the side or interviews or educations, etc. It needs to come from within these practices where their routines are set, where their norms are reproduced, where their ends are actually guiding their work. So it needs to be in that setting that these spaces are created as well, so by the civil servants. What I have found in the interviews that I've done and the workshops that I've been part of leading is that specifically acknowledging and sort of explicitly talking about long-term and transboundary risks have led to what I would say more interesting and important discussions about the values that are guiding work, what values we would like to uphold or guide society, but also the trade-offs that are necessary then and the power dynamics that need to be dealt with in order to change how we work with adaptation, etc. But what usually happens with that discussion is that it ends in dystopic visions of the future of despair, that there is no real alternative. So leaving incremental adaptation behind sort of that unless we have other alternatives, it just leads to despair. So to end, it's clear that new visions are necessary, and I would say this is not in no way this is revolutionary or new. I think the academics and specifically political movements have been saying this for a very long time. We need new ideas and new ideas of what a good life, good society is. But what I would say is that in itself is not enough. We have ideas, we have visions. They've been there for a long time if you look for them. What we need is to translate these our imagination, our visions of the future, and when they are actually translated and when they become incorporated in how we understand and act without really thinking, when they become our practical understandings, when they become our routine responses, guiding and reflective actions, then I think we can see real signs of transformative change, including in the adaptation governance. I would also say that from my work, I think I was more optimistic when I started this PhD, that we have knowledge, we have laws, we have agreements, and studying these networks that were set up to sort of start dealing with adaptation in a new way, that we could sort of use the state as it is to deal with this. I'm more pessimistic now. I don't really think that the changes will come from inside. The system will not reinvent itself. What I see is more that the same kind of logics are reproducing themselves, even in the contexts where it's set up of actually trying to reform the system. So I think it's more important than ever to push the system from outside, if that is as an academic, or if it is as an activist, or if it's just actually living in a different way, eco-village or permaculture society or whatever. I think that the ideas of changing the society will not come from within, it will come from outside. So thank you for listening. And that's here. If you want to stay in touch, here's my contact info and a picture of my newly published thesis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christoffer. That was a super interesting talk, and I like you're digging deeper into root causes of the way we're thinking and the way our world is moving forward. Thank you for being with us at Researcher's Desk.